Welcome back to Bedtime Stories with Laura. Today we are continuing The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis. We will be reading chapters 2 and 3. The Magician's Nephew, Chapter 2, Didgery and His Uncle. It was so sudden and so horrible, unlike anything that had ever happened to Didgery, even in a nightmare, that he let out a scream. Instantly, Uncle Andrew's hand was over his mouth. "None of that," he hissed in Didgery's ear. "If you start making a noise, your mother'll hear it, and you know what a fright might do to her." As Didgery said afterward, the horrible meanness of getting at a chap in that way almost made him sick. But of course he didn't scream again. "That's better," said Uncle Andrew. "Perhaps you couldn't help it. It is a shock when you first see someone vanish. Why, it gave me even a turn when the guinea pig did it the other night." "Was that when you yelled?" asked Didgery. "Oh, you heard that, did you? I hope you haven't been spying on me." "No, I haven't," said Didgery indignantly. "But what's happened to Polly?" "Congratulate me, my dear boy," said Uncle Andrew, rubbing his hands. "My experiment has succeeded. The little girl's gone, vanished, right out of the world." "What have you done to her?" "Sent her to to another place." "What do you mean?" asked Didgery. Uncle Andrew sat down and said, "Well, I'll tell you all about it. Have you ever heard of an old Mrs. LeFay?" "Wasn't she a great aunt or something?" said Didgery. "Not exactly," said Uncle Andrew. "She was my godmother. That's her, there, on the wall." Didgery looked and saw a faded photograph. It showed the face of an old woman in a bonnet, and he could now remember that he had once seen a photo of the same face in an old drawer at home in the country. He had asked his mother who it was, and Mother had not seemed to want to talk about the subject much. It was not at all a nice face, Didgery thought, though of course with those early photographs one could never really tell. Wasn't there something wrong about her, Uncle Andrew?" he said. "Well," said Uncle Andrew with a chuckle, "it depends what you call wrong. People are so narrow-minded. She certainly got very queer in later life. Did very unwise things. That was why they shut her up." "In an asylum, do you mean?" "Oh, no, Uncle Andrew," in a shocked voice. Nothing of that sort. Only in a prison." "I say," said Didgery. What had she done?" "Poor woman," said Uncle Andrew. "She'd been very unwise. There were a good many different things. We needn't go into all that. She was always very kind to me." "But look here, what has all this got to do with Polly? I do wish you'd—" "All in good time, my boy," said Uncle Andrew. "They let old Mrs. LeFay out before she died, and I was one of the very few people whom she would allow to see her in her last illness. She had got to dislike ordinary, ignorant people. You understand, I do myself. But she and I were interested in the same sorts of things. It was only a few days before her death that she told me to go to an old bureau in her house and open a secret drawer and bring her a little box that I would find there. The moment I picked up that box, I could tell by the prickling in my fingers that I held some great secret in my hands. She gave it to me and made me promise that as soon as she was dead, I would burn it, unopened, with certain ceremonies that I promised I did not keep." "Well then, it was jolly rotten of you," said Didgery. "Rotten?" said Uncle Andrew with a puzzled look. "Oh, I see. You mean that little boy ought to keep their promises? Very true. Most right and proper, I'm sure, and I'm very glad you have been taught to do it. But, of course, you must understand that rules of that sort, however excellent they may be for little boys and servants and women and even people in general, can't possibly be expected to apply to profound students and great thinkers and sages. No, Didgeridoo. Men like me, who possess hidden wisdom, are freed from common rules, just as we are cut off from common pleasures. Ours, my boy, is high and lonely destiny. As he said this, he sighed and looked so grave and noble and mysterious that for a second Didgeridoo really thought he was saying something rather fine. But then he remembered the ugly look that he had seen on his uncle's face the moment before Polly had vanished. And all at once he saw through Uncle Andrew's grand words. All it means, he said to himself, is that he thinks he can do anything he likes to get anything he wants. Of course, said Uncle Andrew. I didn't dare to open the box for a long time, for I knew it might contain something highly dangerous. For my grandmother was a very remarkable woman. The truth is, she was one of the last mortals in this country who had fairy blood in her. She said there had been 2 others in her time. One was a duchess and the other was a chairwoman. In fact, Didgeridoo, you are now talking to the last man possibly who really had a fairy godmother. There, that'll be something for you to remember when you are an old man yourself. I bet she was a bad fairy, thought Didgeridoo, and added out loud, but what about Polly? How do you harp on that, said Uncle Andrew, as if that was what mattered. My first task was of course, to study the box itself. It was very ancient, and I knew enough even then to know that it wasn't Greek or Old Egyptian or Babylonian or Hittite or Chinese. It was older than any of those nations. Ah, that was a great day when I at last found out the truth. The box was Atlantean. It came from the lost island of Atlantis. That meant it was centuries older than any of the Stone Age things they dig up in Europe. And it wasn't a rough, crude thing like them either, for in the very dawn of time, Atlantis was already a great city with palaces and temples and learned men. He paused for a moment, as if he expected Didgeridoo to say something, but Didgeridoo was disliking his uncle more every minute, so he said nothing. Meanwhile, continued Uncle Andrew, I was learning a good deal in other ways. It wouldn't be proper to explain them to a child. About magic in general. That meant that I came to have a fair idea what sort of things might be in the box. But various tests I narrowed down the possibilities. I had to get to know some devilish queer people and go through some very disagreeable experiences. That was what turned my head gray. One doesn't become a magician for nothing. My health broke down in the end, but I got better, and at last I actually knew. Although there was not really the least chance of anyone overhearing them, he leaned forward and almost whispered as he said, "The Atlantean box contained something that had been brought from another world when our world was only just beginning." "What?" said Didgeridoo, who was now interested in spite of himself. "Only dust," said Uncle Andrew. "Fine, dry dust. Nothing much to look at. Not much to show for a lifetime of toil, you might say. Ah, but when I looked at that dust, I took jolly good care not to touch it, and thought that every grain had once been in another world. I don't mean another planet, you know. They're part of our world, and you could get to them if you went far enough. But a really other world, another nature, another universe, somewhere you would never reach, even if you traveled through the space of this universe forever and ever. A world that could be reached only by magic. Well," here Uncle Andrew rubbed his hands till his knuckles cracked like fireworks. "I knew it," he went on. that if only you could get it into the right form, that dust would draw you back to the place it had come from. But the difficulty was to get it into the right form. My earlier experiments were all failures. I tried them on guinea pigs. Some of them only died. Some exploded like little bombs. It was a drolly, cruel thing to do, said Didgery, who had once had a guinea pig of his own. How do you keep getting off the point, said Uncle Andrew. And that's what those creatures were for. I brought them myself. Let me see, where was I? Yes. At last I succeeded in making the rings, the yellow rings. But now a new difficulty arose. I was pretty sure now that a yellow ring would send any creature that touched it into the other place. But what would be the good of that if I couldn't get them back to tell me what they had found there? And what about them, said Didgery. A nice mess they'd be in if they couldn't get back. You will keep on looking at everything from that wrong point of view, said Uncle Andrew, with a look of impatience. Can't you understand that the thing is a great experiment? The whole point of sending anyone into the other place is that I want to find out what it's like. Well, why didn't you go yourself then? Didgery had hardly ever seen anyone look so surprised and offended as his uncle did at that simple question. Me, he explained. That the boy must be mad. A man at my time of life and in my state of health to risk the shock and the danger of being flung suddenly into a different universe? I never heard anything so preposterous in my life. Do you realize what you're saying? Think what another world means. You might meet anything. And I suppose you've sent Polly into it then, said Didgery. His cheeks were flaming with anger now. And all I can say, he added, even if you are my uncle, is that you've behaved like a coward, sending a girl to a place you're afraid of to go yourself. Silence, sir, said Uncle Andrew, bringing his hand down on the table. I will not be talked to like that by a little dirty schoolboy. You don't understand. I'm a great scholar, the magician, the adept, who is doing the experiment, of course. I need subjects to do it on. Bless my soul, you'll be telling me next that I ought to have asked the guinea pig's permission before I used them. No great wisdom can be reached without sacrifice, but the idea of my going myself is ridiculous. It's like asking a general to fight a common soldier. Supposing I got killed, what would become of my life's work? Oh, do stop jawing, said Didgery. Are you going to bring Polly back? I was going to tell you, when you so rudely interrupted me, said Uncle Andrew, that I did at last find out a way of doing the return journey. The green rings draw you back. But Polly hasn't got a green ring. No, said Uncle Andrew with a cruel smile. Then she can't get back, shouted Didgery. And it's exactly the same as if you'd murdered her. She can't get back, said Uncle Andrew. If someone else will go after her, wearing a yellow ring himself and taking 2 green rings, once to bring himself back and one to bring her back. And now, of course, Didgery saw the trap in which he was caught. He stared at Uncle Andrew, saying nothing, with his mouth wide open. His cheeks had gone very pale. I hope, said Uncle Andrew presently, in a very high and mighty voice, just as if he was a perfect uncle who had given one a handsome tip and some good advice. I hope, Didgery, you are not given to showing the white feather. I should be very sorry to think anyone of our family had not enough honor and chivalry to go to the aid of a lady in distress. Oh, shut up, said Didgery. If you had any honor at all, that you'd be going yourself. But I know you won't. All right, I see I've got to go. But you are a beast. I suppose you planned the whole thing so that she'd go without knowing it, and then I'd have to go after her. Of course, said Uncle Andrew with a hateful smile. Very well, I'll go, but there's one thing I jolly well mean to say first. I didn't believe in magic till today. I see now it's real. Well, if it is, I suppose all the old fairy tales are more or less true, and you're simply a wicked, cruel magician like the ones in the stories. Well, I've never read a story in which people of that sort weren't paid out in the end, and I bet you will be. And it serves you right. All the things Didgeridoo had said, this was the first that really went home. Uncle Andrew started, and there came over his face a look of such horror that beasts thought he was. You could almost feel sorry for him, but a second later he smoothed it all away and said with a rather forced laugh, well, I suppose that is a natural thing for a child to think, brought up amongst women, as you have been. Old wives' tales. I don't think you need worry about my danger, Didgeridoo. Wouldn't it be better to worry about the danger of your little friend? She's been gone some time. If there are any dangers over there, well, it would be a pity to arrive a moment too late. A lot you care, said Didgeridoo fiercely, but I'm sick of this jaw. What have I got to do? You really must learn to control that temper of yours, my boy, said Uncle Andrew coolly. Otherwise you'll grow up to be just like your Aunt Letty, now attending me. He got up, put on a pair of gloves, and walked over to the tray that contained the rings. They only work, he said, if they're actually touching your skin. Wearing gloves, I can pick them up like this, and nothing happens. If you carried one in your pocket, nothing would happen. But of course, you'd have to be careful not to put your hand in your pocket and touch it by accident. The moment you touch a yellow ring, you vanish out of this world. When you are in the other place, I expect, of course, this hasn't been tested yet, but I expect that the moment you touch a green ring, you vanish out of that world, and I expect reappear in this. Now, I take these two green and drop them into your right pocket. Remember very carefully which pocket the greens are in. G for green, R for right. GR, you see, which are the first two letters of green. One for you and one for the little girl. And now you pick up a yellow one for yourself. I should put it on your finger. If I were you, there'll be less chance of dropping it. Didgeridoo had almost picked up the yellow ring when he suddenly checked himself. Look here, he said. What about Mother? Suppose she asks where I am? The sooner you go, the sooner you'll be back, said Uncle Andrew cheerfully. But you don't really know where I can get back. Uncle Andrew shrugged his shoulders, walking across to the door and unlocking it and threw it open and said, Oh, very well then, just as you please. Go down and have your dinner. Leave the little girl to be eaten by wild animals, or drowned, or starved in the other world, or lost there for good, if that's what you prefer. It's all one to me. Perhaps before tea time, you'd better drop in on Mrs. Plummer and explain that she'll never see her daughter again, because you were afraid to put on a ring. By gum, said Didgeridoo, don't I just wish I was big enough to punch your head. Then he buttoned up his coat, took a deep breath, and picked up the ring, and thought then, as he always thought afterward too, that he could not decently have done anything else. Chapter 3. The Wood Between the Worlds. Uncle Andrew and his study vanished instantly. Then for a moment everything became muddled. The next thing Didgeridoo knew was that there was a soft green light coming down on him from above, and darkness below. He didn't seem to be standing on anything, or sitting, or lying. Nothing appeared to be touching him. I believe I'm in water, said Didgeridoo, or underwater. This frightened him for a second, but almost at once he could feel that he was rushing upward. Then his head suddenly came out into the air, and he found himself scrambling ashore. Out onto a smooth, grassy ground at the edge of the pool. As he rose to his feet, he noticed that he was neither dripping nor panting for breath as anyone would expect after being underwater. His clothes were perfectly dry. He was standing by the edge of a small pool, not more than 10 feet from side to side in a wood. The trees grew close together and were so leafy that he could get no glimpse of the sky. All the lights was green lights that came through the leaves, but there must have been a very strong sun overhead, for this green daylight was bright and warm. It was the quietest wood you could possibly imagine. There were no birds, no insects, no animals, and no wind. You could almost feel the trees growing. The pool he had just got out of was not the only pool. There were dozens of others, a pool every few yards, as far as his eyes could reach. You could almost feel the trees drinking the water up with their roots. This wood was very much alive. When he tried to describe it afterwards, Didgeridoo always said it was a rich place, as rich as plum cake. The strangest thing was that almost before he had looked about him, Didgeridoo had half forgotten how he had come there, and at any rate, he was certainly not thinking about Polly or Uncle Andrew or even his mother. He was not in the least frightened or excited or curious, or if anyone had asked him, "Where did you come from?" he would probably have said, "I've always been here." That was what it felt like, as if one had always been in that place and never been bored, although nothing had ever happened. As he said long afterward, it's not the sort of place where things happen. The trees go on growing, that's all. After Didgeridoo had looked at the woods for a long time, he noticed that there was a girl lying on her back at the foot of a tree, a few yards away. Her eyes were nearly shut, but not quite, as if she were just between sleeping and waking. So he looked at her for a long time and said nothing. And at last she opened her eyes and looked at him for a long time, and she also said nothing. And at last she opened her eyes and looked at him for a long time, and she also said nothing. Then she spoke in a dreamy, content sort of voice. "I think I've seen you before," she said. "I rather think so too," said Didgeridoo. "Have you been here long?" "Oh, always," said the girl. "At least, I don't know, a very long time." "So have I," said Didgeridoo. "No, you haven't," said the girl. "I've just seen you come up out of that pool." "Yes, I suppose I did," said Didgeridoo with a puzzled air. "I'd forgotten." Then for quite a long time neither said anything. "Look here," said the girl presently. "I wonder, did we ever really meet before? I had a sort of idea, a sort of picture in my head of a boy and a girl like us, living somewhere quite different and doing all sorts of things. Perhaps it was only a dream." "I've had the same dream, I think," said Didgeridoo, "about a boy and a girl living next door, and something about crawling among rafters. I remember the girl had a dirty face." "Aren't you getting it mixed? In my dream it was the boy who had a dirty face." "I can't remember the boy's face," said Didgeridoo, and then added, "Hullo, what's that?" "Why, it's a guinea pig," said the girl. And it was a fat guinea pig, nosing about in the grass. But round the middle of the guinea pig there ran a tape, and tied onto it by the tape was a bright yellow ring. "Look, look!" cried Didgeridoo, "the ring! And look, you've got one on your finger, and so have I." The girl now sat up, really interested at last. They stared very hard at one another, trying to remember, and then at exactly the same moment she shouted out, "Mr. Ketterley!" And he shouted out, "Uncle Andrew!" And they knew who they were and began to remember the whole story. After a few minutes of hard talking, they had got it straight. Didgeridoo explained how beastly Uncle Andrew had been. "What do we do now?" said Polly. "Take the guinea pig and go home?" "There's no hurry," said Didgeridoo with a huge yawn. "I think there is," said Polly. "This place is too quiet. It's so so dreamy. You're almost asleep. If we once give into it, we shall just lie down and drowse forever and ever." "It's very nice here," said Didgery. "Yes, it is," said Polly, "but we've got to get back." She stood up and began to go curiously towards the guinea pig, but then she changed her mind. "We might as well leave the guinea pig," she said. "It's perfectly happy here, and your uncle will only do something horrid to it if we take it home." "I bet he would," said Didgery. "Look at the way he's treated us. By the way, how do we get home?" Go back into the pool, I expect." They came and stood together at the edge, looking down into the smooth water. It was full of the reflection of the green, leafy branches that made it look very deep. "We haven't any bathing things," said Polly. "We shan't need them, silly," said Didgery. "We're going in with our clothes on. Don't you remember it didn't wet us on the way up? Can you swim?" A bit. Can you?" "Well, not much." "I don't think we shall need to swim," said Didgery. "We want to go to London, don't we?" Neither of them much liked the idea of jumping into that pool, but neither said so to the other. They took hands and said, "1, 2, 3, go," and jumped. There was a great splash. Of course they closed their eyes, but when they opened them again, they found they were still standing, hand in hand, in that green wood, and hardly up to their ankles in water. The pool had apparently only a couple of inches deep. They splashed back onto the dry ground. "What on earth's going wrong?" said Polly in a frightened voice, but not quite so frightened as you might expect, because it's hard to feel really frightened in that wood. The place is too peaceful. "Oh, I know," said Didgery. "Of course it won't work. We're still wearing our yellow rings. They're for the outward journey, you know. The green ones take you home. We must change rings. Have you got pockets? Good. Put your yellow ring in your left. I've got 2 green here. One for you." They put on their green rings and came back to the pool. But before they tried another jump, Didgery gave a long, "Oh. "What's the matter?" said Polly. "I've had a really wonderful idea," said Didgery. "What are all the other pools?" "How do you mean?" "Why, if we can get back to our own world by jumping into this pool, mightn't we get somewhere else by jumping into one of the others? Supposing there was a world at the bottom of every pool." "But I thought we were already in your uncle's other world, or other place, or whatever he called it, didn't you say?" "Oh, bother Uncle Andrew," interrupted Didgery. "I don't believe he knows anything about it. He never had the pluck to come here himself. He only talked of one other world, but suppose there were dozens." "You mean this wood might be only one of them?" "No, I don't believe this wood is a world at all. I think it's just a sort of in-between place." Polly looked puzzled. "Don't you see?" said Didgery. "No, do listen. Think of our tunnel under the slates at home. It isn't a room in any of the houses in a way, and it isn't really part of any of the houses, but once you're in the tunnel, you can go along in and come out into any of the houses in the row. Mightn't this wood be the same, a place that isn't in any of the worlds? But once you've found that place, you can get into them all." "Well, even if you can," began Polly, but Didgery went on as if he didn't hear her. "And of course that explains everything," he said. "That's why it is so quiet and sleepy here. Nothing ever happens here, like at home. It's in the house that people talk and do things and have meals. Nothing goes on in the in-between places, behind the walls, above the ceiling, and under the roof, or in our own tunnel. But when you come out of the tunnel, you may find yourself in any house. I think we can get out of this place into a jolly well anywhere. We don't need to jump back into the same pool we came up by, or not just yet." "The wood between the worlds," said Polly dreamily. "It sounds rather nice." "Come on," said Didgery. "Which pool should we try?" "Look here," said Polly. "I'm not going to try any new pool till we've made sure that we can get back by the old one. We've not even sure if it'll work yet." Yes, said Didgery, and get caught by Uncle Andrew and have our rings taken away before we've had any fun? No thanks. Couldn't we just go part of the way down into our own pool, said Polly, just to see if it works? Then if it does, we'll change rings and come up again before we're really back in Mr. Kettle's study. Can we go part of the way down? Well, it took time coming up. I suppose it'd take a little time going back. Didgery made rather a fuss about agreeing to this, but he had to in the end, because Polly absolutely refused to do any exploring in any new world until she made sure that getting back to the old one. She was quite as brave as he about some dangers, wasps for instance, but she was not so interested in finding out things nobody had ever heard of before, for Didgeray was the sort of person who wanted to know everything, and when he grew up, he became the foremost Professor Kirk, who comes into other books. Kirik, I think it's Kirik. After a good deal of arguing, they agreed to put on their green rings. Green for safety, said Didgery, so you can't help remembering which is which, and hold hands and jump. But as soon as they seemed to be getting back to Uncle Andrew's study, or even to their world, Polly was to shout change, and they would slip off their green rings, and put on their yellows. Didgery wanted to be the one who shouted change, but Polly wanted a green. They put on the green rings, took hands, and once more shouted, 1, 2, 3, go. This time it worked. It is very hard to tell you what it felt like, for everything happened so quickly. At first, there were bright lights moving about in black skies. Didgery always thinks these were stars, and even swears that he saw Jupiter quite close enough to see its moon. But almost at once, there were rows and rows of roofs and chimney pots about them, and they could see St. Paul's and knew they were looking at London. But you could see through the walls of all the houses. Then they could see Uncle Andrew, very vague and shadowy, but getting clearer and more solid looking all the time, just as he was coming into focus. But before he became quite real, Polly shouted, change! And they did change, and our world faded away like a dream, and the green lights above grew stronger and stronger, till their heads came out of the pool, and they scrambled ashore, and there was the wood all about them, as green and bright and still as ever. The whole thing had taken less than a minute. There, said Didgery. That's all right now for the adventure. Any pool will do. Come on, let's try that one. Stop, said Polly. Aren't we going to mark this pool? And they stared at each other and turned quite white as they realized the dreadful thing that Didgery had just been going to do. For there were any number of pools in the woods, and the pools were all alike, and the trees were all alike. So that if they had once left behind the pool that led to our world without making some sort of a landmark, the chance would have been 100 to 1 against their ever finding it again. Didgery's hand was shaking as he opened his penknife and cut out a long strip of turf on the bank of the pool. The soil, which smelled nice, was of a rich reddish brown and showed up well against the green. It's a good thing one of us had some sense, said Polly. Well, don't keep on gassing about it, said Didgery. Come along, I want to see what's in one of the other pools. And Polly gave him a pretty sharp answer, and he said something even nastier in reply, and the quarrel lasted for several minutes, but it would be dull to write it all down. Let us skip on to the moment at which they stood with beating hearts and rather scared faces on the edge of an unknown pool, with their yellow rings on, and held hands, and once more said, 1, 2, 3, go! Splash! Once again it hadn't worked. This pool, too, appeared to be only a puddle. Instead of reaching a new world, they only got their feet wet and splashed their legs for the second time that morning. If it was a morning, it seemed to always be the same time in the woods between the worlds. Blasted and bothersome, explained Didgeridoo. What's going wrong now? We've put on our yellow rings on right away, he said. Yellow for outward journeys. Now, the truth was that Uncle Andrew, who knew nothing about the wood between the worlds, had quite a wrong idea about the rings. The yellow ones weren't outward rings, and the green ones weren't homeward rings. At least, not in the way he thought. The stuff of which both were made had all come from the wood. The stuff in the yellow ring had the power to draw you into the wood. It was stuff that wanted to go back to its own place, the in-between place. But the stuff in the green ring is stuff that is trying to get out of its own place, so that a green ring would take you out of the world into another world. Uncle Andrew, you see, was working with things he did not really understand. Most magicians are. Of course, Didgeridoo did not realize the truth quite clearly either, or not till later. But when they had talked it over, they decided to try their green rings on the new pool, just to see what would happen. I'm game if you are, said Polly. But she really said this because in her heart of hearts, she now felt sure that neither kind of ring was going to work at all in the new pool. So there was nothing worse to be afraid of than another splash. I'm not quite sure that Didgeridoo had not the same feeling. At any rate, when they had both put on their green rings and come back to the edge of the water and taken hands again, they were certainly a good deal more cheerful and less solemn than they had been the first time. 1, 2, 3, go, said Didgeridoo, and they jumped in. Thank you for listening to another session of Bedtime Stories with Laura. I hope you can wind down and relax and get to sleep tonight. And next time, you will dive into chapter 4 and possibly 5 of the Magician's Nephew. Have a good night and sweet dreams.